Um, thank you. So, welcome everybody to what is our last session, Zoom only today, but our last session before the summer of Radical Anthropology Group seminars. We will be back in autumn and we'll be back live and on Zoom. But today I was really delighted that Vivek Venkataraman could join us and tell us about some of his most recent work on around the man-hunter debate. He's also been talking a lot with Richard Lee, who's a good friend of ours and obviously very famous amongst hunter-gatherer scholars. And we have with us too Helga Drever here, who is a former student of Richard Lee's. So we're quite plugged into some of the angles on the man-hunter debate. Vivek is a biological anthropologist using evolutionary approaches to study foraging behavior, energetics, and health. He's assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Calgary. And his current research focuses very much on the Batek in Malaysia, alongside our colleague Ivan Tafsi, who's also working there. And he's one of the main principal investigators of Orang Asli Health and Lifeways Project. And also, I'm very pleased to know that he has just taken on co-editing hunter-gatherer research, which is a key journal of for hunter-gatherer scholars of hunter-gatherer behaviours. So, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this, Vivek. And yes, please tell us more.
Just to say, Jerome Lewis is coming as well.
Oh, he's going to be late, but he'll be here. Great.
Great. Okay, I just put headphones in. You guys still hear me?
Yep.
Good. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Camila. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm really glad to be here talking about our new preprint. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Okay, everyone see full screen?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. All right, great. Okay, yeah, so let me just make sure I can move my cursor. There we go. Okay, so my talk today is about a preprint we just put up about a month ago. It's called The Meanings and Dividends of Man the Hunter. This is a work that has been in process for a couple of years now with a lot of other co-authors. So this is not only my work, but also theirs. This is currently in review at Evolution Human Behavior, and so we'll be getting feedback on that through the review process. I've also gotten feedback through email and on social media from people. So this is very much a work in progress, and I'd be delighted to hear any thoughts that you think could kind of improve our arguments. So let's go. Okay, so I want to start by talking about how I kind of got involved in all this. How did all this start out? Um, this has been going on for a couple years now, this kind of interest in man the hunter. And it was kicked off by this paper, which many of you will be familiar with. So in 2020, Randy Haas and colleagues published this paper called Female Hunters of the Early Americas, looking at an archaeological site now 9,000 years old in Peru. And it found associations with female skeletons and hunting toolkits. And so the argument was made that there were female big game hunters in this population. And as we see in this last sentence here, these findings are consistent with non-gendered labor practices in the past. Again, females were big game hunters. So this paper made a big splash. It was very interesting. There were also challenges to it from archaeologists about the inferences that were made. I won't go into that at the moment, but I'm just kind of setting the stage here. Next slide. Now in 2023, so that paper was focused on archaeology. In 2023, a paper came out by Anderson et al. That focused more on the ethnographic record. And what they did was they did a cross-cultural survey looking at all sorts of different societies and examining the ones in which women hunt. And what they found was that women hunt, according to their analysis, in almost 80% of foraging societies, with big game hunting occurring uh, by women in about 33% of these. And I'll get to the critiques of that in a moment. And then next, later that year, these two papers came out, led by Kara Okabach and Sarah Lacey, again, kind of pushing this woman the hunter angle from physiological and archaeological viewpoints. Now, to say the least, this took the world by storm. There were a lot of media articles in prestigious venues, Scientific American, Science, the New York Times, basically saying, we've killed the myth of man the hunter. Man the hunter has been debunked. As El País said, women have always hunted as much as men. So if you're someone who's not an anthropologist, who's not familiar with this kind of work, it might seem as if we've had this kind of radical restructuring of knowledge. And in fact, I was interviewed for some of these studies, including the one with NPR, and talking to the journalists, it was very much the sense of, how have anthropologists ignored this evidence for so long that women hunt as well? It was almost kind of a conspiratorial tone, which I found kind of interesting. Now, the reason I got involved in all this, I mean, I think otherwise I would have read the news articles and kind of moved on. But me and my students back in 2022, 23, we were working on a very similar study as the Anderson paper. So Jordy Hoffman, who is here today, and Kyle Farquharson, both at University of Calgary, we were doing a cross-cultural study of women's hunting as well. And what we did is we used HREF, the Human Relations Area Files, as well as other ethnographic sources. And we were using theory from behavioral ecology to ask the question of why, when, how do women hunt? So we were synthesizing the rather large body of evidence about this and trying to make inferences about whether and how women's hunting occurred in the past. And so when we came across the Anderson paper, we were a little bit surprised. Let me just try to go back here for a second. We were a little bit surprised because I had just spent the past few months with Jordy and Kyle pouring through all the ethnographic reports of women's hunting among hunter-gatherers, and we came to vastly different conclusions than the Anderson et al. Paper did. We weren't trying to estimate the frequency of hunting, though, across societies. So we thought something was up, and long story short, we ended up writing a response once we dug in to this Anderson uh, piece, trying to replicate their analysis. And what we found is that, again, long story short, the methods are not really replicable. We weren't really able to do it. We tried really hard. Um, but what we did find was widespread evidence of likely selection bias, okay, meaning that they were inflating the frequency of women's hunting through the decisions that you make along the steps when you analyze data, from having your sample to coding it. A lot of these steps we found tended to increase the likelihood of women's hunting, and thus they arrive at a very high estimate. The main thing I'll point out now is that there was a conflation of rare versus frequent or habitual hunting. So if you had a society in which it said that women hunt, you know, once every 10 years or something, that would have the same level of evidence as a society in which hunting was frequent. So that's not actually telling us all that much. And we ended up redoing some of their coding. And again, we found a lot of errors in the codings. We found different answers. Again, I won't go through all this, but basically we find that, this wasn't overturning the idea that it's mostly men that do the hunting, mostly women that do the gathering, with, of course, flexibility. So we said female foragers sometimes hunt, yet gender divisions of labor are real. So I have argued that the media storm around this is not really justified by the evidence. And there were some other aspects of these papers that I think hunter-gatherer scholars found a little bit off-putting. For one, there was the focus on hunting alone, right? For decades now, we've been talking about how cooperation in foragers is complicated. It's multifaceted, it's multidimensional. Men and women play complementary subsistence roles. To focus only on hunting or only on gathering, I think we've sort of moved beyond that. There's also this sort of implicit idea that hunting is necessarily better than any other kind
Yeah.
of labor. But we think that this is a form of projection onto these societies of sort of how we are seeing the world. And I'm not sure that that is really appropriate. So again, that's just summarizing our argument from this paper. Now, as all this was going on, I sort of developed a sense that there was even a deeper underlying issue. It's not only about the data on women's hunting itself, but it's the way that we talk about these things. It's the way that we refer to the phrase man the hunter or divisions of labor. And I think this is summarized in that Anderson piece where it says the prevalence of data on women hunting directly oppose the common belief that women exclusively gather while men exclusively hunt. So, of course, as foragers or scholars will read this sentence and say, well, I don't know anyone who actually uh, believes that. I don't think people in our field have believed that for 50 or 60 years potentially. And so their aim here was to deconstruct the general man the hunter narrative. And what I think we've realized is that that phrase, man the hunter, that there is actually no general narrative. It's actually a term that has multiple meanings, and people are using them in different ways and actually confusing those. And that kind of explains some of the issues that have arisen with the media treatment around man the hunter. So if you were to ask someone on the street what they think of when we say the phrase man the hunter, they might point to an idea that was developed in the early 20th century, if not earlier, in which hunting, which was done by man, really shaped human evolution. I mean, this, in a sense, go back to Darwin, right? Hunting made us upright. It made males cooperate. It facilitated tool use and so on. But this is a very kind of deterministic version of the hunting hypothesis, the idea of biologically fixed, genetically rooted sex roles with very little flexibility. And so the implication is that in the human past, we had very rigid sexual divisions of labor. And added on to this was this idea of aggression, violence, and warfare. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but the idea is that the lust for hunting, it kind of spills over into other aspects of social life. And so this is why males are so aggressive. It's why our species is predisposed to warfare. And so when we look at the kind of cultural products around this way of thinking, whether it's like I dug up some sexist 1950s, divisions of labor, uh, posters here where, women don't leave the kitchen or the sort of like caveman type stuff. This really goes back to, as I'll argue, Dart and Ardrey. And we see here in 2001 Space Odyssey, this famous dawn of man scene, I think goes back to that as well. But there's another way to look at the phrase man the hunter as well, which is the conference in 1966, and then the subsequent publication that gave rise to modern hunter-gatherer studies. This was the first time that people came together and said, okay, what can we learn from hunter-gatherers today to inform our ideas of the past? And this resulted in the field of the behavioral ecology of hunter-gatherers, as well as work on social anthropology of hunter-gatherers. And what this large body of work has shown is that it is indeed men that usually hunt, women usually gather, but this pattern is flexible. And I would say, I don't think I'm, exaggerating to say that this is kind of the consensus view of people working in the field. Now, the real problem here, though, is that these two meanings that I just outlined, they get confused, right? And we see this a lot in recent literature. So in The Creative Spark by Agustin Fuentes, he writes that the 1966 Man the Hunter laid the idea for a basic concept of early man banding together using sticks and stones to hunt down animals, kill them, and so on and so forth. So it's that kind of strong version of the hunting hypothesis, but it's associated, this is a key point, with the conference as a whole, okay? Not individual chapters, but the conference as a whole. And we see the same thing in one of the Okabach and Lacey articles. So this idea formalized in the edited volume Man the Hunter of a deep sexual division of labor rooted in sex-based biological differences. Males are dominant and prominent. And then what's quoted here is a chapter by Laughlin. And as I'll show you in a minute, this is actually probably the most extreme chapter in the Man the Hunter volume. But again, you see a conflation of this idea with the volume and the conference itself. Okay, so to summarize this kind of first part of the talk, the phrase man the hunter, it's been associated with sexist theories of human evolution. I think we can agree that those exist. They're influential, unfortunately, and they're problematic. But wildly disparate use of the phrase has led to unnecessary, I think, disagreement and popular misunderstanding. I would argue that there's actually quite a bit of consensus based on the empirical record around a lot of these issues. So our goal in this paper is not to say that, this isn't really a defense of Man the Hunter. It's not saying that we can't critique Man the Hunter, the volume, or the other versions of it. But it's to really say, let's get our terminology straight here and let's be clear about who is saying what, and this will help improve the quality of our scholarship moving forward. So that's what our paper is doing. Here is the abstract here, and this will provide the outline for what I talk about for the rest of the day. So we're distinguishing three meanings of man the hunter. First, the early to mid 20th century idea that was propagated by popular writers, focusing on hunting men, aggression, rigid divisions of labor, immutable sex differences. And then second, the man the hunter conference and volume. And then third, developments in the field of hunter-gatherer behavioral ecology. And then at the end, I'm going to ask, how are these actually related? How did these different fields evolve in concert, or was it separately? Because the answer to that question should tell us about how we should talk about man, the hunter. Okay, so let's get to our first meaning, which I've kind of touched on a little bit already. Many of you will be familiar with Raymond Dart, famous paleoanthropologist working in the early 20th century, discovering the Tong child, Australopithecus africanus, and he devised the killer ape theory, and he wrote about it in very purple prose, basically about how early humankind was shaped by the development of lethal weapons that kind of gave us this bloodthirsty instinct, and that's actually what made us human, right? These are kind of two sides of the same coin. And so here's an example of one of these quotes. Our ancestor, the ape man's instinct for violence, successful development of lethal weapons, gave him dominance in the animal world from the beginning, and those are with us today, right? So that is known as the killer ape theory. This was actually heavily critiqued by anthropologists when it was first proposed, accepted by others, but also heavily critiqued. Now, in the 1950s, Dart ran into a playwright named Robert Ardrey. Okay, so he worked, in screenwriting most of his career, but he was actually an anthropology major at the University of Chicago. And in his retirement, he got interested again in these issues. And he saw Dart as kind of a victim of the anthropological community that wasn't paying attention to an idea that was clearly correct. Okay. So Robert Ardrey wrote the Nature of Man series, these four books here, which, by the way, these have been reissued by Amazon and they have extremely high ratings, right? 4.5 to 5 stars. People love these. Only in the past few years have I actually read these books. These aren't actually taught in anthropology, which is kind of my point here. I read these books and they're a lot of fun to read, right? You can tell that he's a screenwriter. These ideas really grab people. I was, reading it like, wow, this is really exciting to read. But he kind of devised his own idea of the hunting hypothesis, right? So hunting led to food sharing, the male role of provider, the bipolar society that was sexually segregated, and the female role of defender of the home site. Okay, so according to Ardrey, women were basically just reproducing all the time. They weren't really doing much else. So he portrayed them as sexual specialists, counteracting the tendency of social males who were doing things other than reproduction. So Ardrey was kind of taking Dart's ideas and then building on them more and putting that all together into this kind of cohesive idea that I will call sort of a strong version of the hunting hypothesis. Now, Ardrey wasn't the only one who was selling best-selling books in the 60s and 70s. There's also Desmond Morris. And Desmond Morris in The Naked Ape, The Human Zoo, he kind of has the same ideas as as Ardrey. Here's a quote again about what women are doing. Um, because of the extremely long period of dependency of young and the heavy demands, females found themselves almost perpetually confined to the home base. Okay, so I'm kind of lumping Dart, Ardrey, Morris together here. And the point I want to make now is that we can ask, where were they getting their evidence from? Where was this stuff coming from? And what I've been realizing is that it's not coming from hunter-gatherer studies. It's not coming from anthropology, ethnology. It was all pretty much coming from animal behavior, as well as paleoanthropology. Again, Dart was a paleoanthropologist. So Konrad Lorenz, Miko Tinbergen, these are very famous scholars of animal behavior who focus their efforts on, looking at the behavior of birds, lions, wolves, and so on. And so for Ardrey and Morris, uh, these animals were actually more relevant to reconstructing deep human ancestry than modern day hunter-gatherers, which is kind of an interesting claim that we'll unpack in a minute here. And Ardrey's voice was also boosted a little bit by Louis Leakey, who had his own ideas about aggression. They actually hosted a discussion at Caltech in the early 70s, I think. And it was really interesting that, Leakey was aggressive in his own right, but he was actually calling out Ardrey for his propagation of this bloodthirsty ape man um, idea. So these ideas were getting a lot of popular traction, uh, but not necessarily in an anthropological world. Again, these ideas they conform really well to explaining why 1950s suburban life in the US was the way that it was. It kind of just made a lot of sense to people, right? And then you have Kubrick, 2001 Space Odyssey, that first scene where we are, born of violence, nature red in tooth and claw. He was actually directly inspired by Ardrey. I mean, this comes directly from Ardrey. So that's what was going on in the 60s and 70s in terms of the creation of human nature. It was coming from ethology, it was coming from paleoanthropology, and it created a lot of the negative stereotypes that we call sexist today. If you're interested in learning more about this, these are two good books I would recommend, Killer Instinct and Creatures of Cain. They talk a lot about the stuff I was just, you know, glossing over basically, but I'd recommend you take a look at this if you're interested. Okay, so that's the first meaning of man the hunter, and that's what most people I think mean when they talk about man the hunter. But let's talk about the conference now. So in 1966, um, a bunch of anthropologists, about 75 anthropologists, got together at the University of Chicago to talk about, again, how can we look to modern day foragers and reconstruct the human past. 75 participants. Unfortunately, only it seems like 5 to 7 maybe were women. Those who were there were very prominent. I've highlighted some of them here. This is in an article I wrote with Richard Lee recently. June Helm, Lorna Marshall, um, Sally Binford, archaeologist Sally Binford. So, in addition to them, you had Saul Tax. It was actually his idea to do this conference, apparently. Sherwood Washburn. He was a professor at Berkeley. He's had a massive impact on physical or biological anthropology. Richard Lee, who we all know right here, famous ethnographer of the Kung. Irv DeVore, who was actually at this time focused a little more on baboon studies. Glenn Isaac, Marshall Solins, Louis Binford, Chagnon, Levi Strauss, Woodburn. The list goes on. Lots of famous names. And recently, I was trying to get a better understanding of what this conference was really like. What was it like on the ground? What were the broader social conditions that led to this conference? Why was it needed? And so I reached out to Richard Lee. Richard Lee, as far as I can tell, was the youngest person at the Man the Hunter conference. I think he was something like 27 or 28. Irv DeVore was just a few years older. And we started holding a series of conversations, and it's been one of the most fantastic experiences of my life. For the past year, Richard and I have been talking nearly every week, often about Man the Hunter, but also about other stuff. And he's given me so much insight into how things work. I think we have a tendency now to just look at the volume and think, okay, well, it's just that. But actually, this is the product of a lot of brilliant but also flawed people who were working in the 1960s. So I recently published this in Hunter-Gatherer Research, if you'd like to take a look. But I basically asked a bunch of questions about the Man the Hunter conference. Now, for our purposes, what I want to point out is that Man the Hunter, the conference, it was not just one thing. Okay. It was not just the chapters that promoted hunting. Now, there were two of those. So we'll point out those ones here. The Evolution of Hunting by Washburn and Lancaster. And then, as I mentioned before, this one, Hunting by William Laughlin. So these are very strong versions of the hunting hypothesis that hunting shaped humanity, like I mentioned before. But they are probably, I mean, they are the strongest ones there in terms of this emphasis on hunting. One thing I'll note that I learned from Richard is that the Washburn and Lancaster chapter, this was actually not even presented at Man the Hunter. So when we're trying to recreate how this was going and what people were talking about, they weren't even talking about this stuff. I'm actually not sure about the Laughlin chapter, but this was submitted after the fact in the 2 years between the publication, or sorry, the conference and then the publication. So that, to me, it sort of shed a different light on how the conversations actually would have gone. And then, of course, we have the chapters that we think of as being kind of canonical Man the Hunter chapters, at least if you're a hunter-gatherer scholar. Richard Lee, What Hunters Do for a Living. This was one of the first papers to really call attention to the importance of women's gathering and say, it's not really all about hunting. There was Marshall Solins, who advanced the idea of the original affluent society, going after this idea that hunter-gatherers are, teetering on the edge of starvation. There were also mentions of women's hunting in this chapter by Hitoshi Watanabe, and he says, hey, look, this is actually not a rare phenomenon. Okay, so the idea here is that the discussions were diverse, and there was also a lot of disagreement. And this is what we go over in our paper. I can't go over all this now, but there was disagreement about the subsistence base of modern and prehistoric hunter-gatherers, a lot of debate about aggression and territoriality, ethnographic analogy and its pitfalls, sex differences, um, the nitty-gritty stuff like marriage patterns and kinship. There was also a lot of discussion around what was happening to hunter-gatherers, land rights, and culture loss. Now, I think part of the issue here is that the title Man the Hunter is admittedly very old-fashioned, right? Especially given what we just saw, that the contributions were actually very diverse, and if anything, they were kind of undermining that idea of Man the Hunter. So in the introduction, they talk about their terminology where they use hunters as a shorthand, despite the fact that majority of peoples considered subsisted on sources other than meat. So this was acknowledged then. And I think maybe the most interesting fact I learned from Richard was that the title of the conference, Man the Hunter, it was really up to Washburn. He was kind of the big shot in the mid 1960s, and Lee and DeVore were his PhD students. So you can't contradict your PhD advisor, and they had to just go with it, even though they actually pleaded with him. They said, this is really outdated. It's old-fashioned. I think we should go with something, a little bit more inclusive and broad than just Man the Hunter. And Washburn said, nah, don't worry about it. It's fine. But this has, I think, ended up contributing to a lot of the misunderstanding that I've been talking about. I'll also note that the people who are at Man the Hunter, this wasn't like a stodgy old group of white guys. I mean, there were a lot, but it was a rather young group of participants. I think we calculated the average age was late 30s or early 40s, maybe. Um, there were also a lot of leftist activists. You might know the contributions of Saul Tax helping out with land claims and civil rights for Native Americans in the U.S. Marshall Solins kind of invented the teach-in, protesting the Vietnam War. when Levi Strauss stood up to give his address at the end of the conference, he looked out and he basically said, I don't know any of you. He said the age bracket has changed. And so that to me is really telling that we're seeing a changing of the guard here, and that it still has the title Man the Hunter, but it was really presaging what was to come about a revolution in hunter-gatherer studies. Richard told me a great anecdote that while Levi Strauss was giving his address, Les Hyatt and Mervyn Meggitt were basically talking shit about him. They were muttering, bad-mouthing him. Uh, and if you've read the volume closely, you'll know that this was a constant source of kind of rancor at the conference, was that they were undermining Levi Strauss's ideas about Australian Aboriginal kinship. They were saying, we've done the field work and this doesn't really add up. And so here they were bad mouthing him while he was giving his address. And to me, that really shows again that this changing of the guard is happening. So nevertheless, there's been like a conflation of the man the hunter conference with those ideas I talked about earlier, dart, archery, and so on. But this confusion has actually mostly been, I have to say, recent. My colleague here at the University of Calgary, Linda Fedigan, wrote this great article in the mid 1980s. And here she says the papers in Man the Hunter, championing as they did the explanatory power of hunting, and she's referring to the chapters I highlighted, also provided the insights and data that were to lead to its undoing. So we have to look beyond just the title of Man the Hunter. It was actually really starting a revolution. And that revolution was what happened in the subsequent years, which is the meaning three, the behavioral ecology of hunter-gatherers, also including all the work done on social anthropology of hunter-gatherers. I'm more of a quantitative behavioral ecologist, so that's what I'll talk about, but I don't want to dismiss the really important contributions by social anthropologists that we, even as quantitative behavioral ecologists, use and really appreciate. But what the conference did was it inspired further research to integrate paleoanthropology, primatology, archaeology, human behavioral ecology to understand human origins. And indeed, at Man the Hunter, they even write, here we have raised more questions than we've answered. I think there was a realization that things were sort of just getting started here. Okay, so what is human behavioral ecology? Oh, sorry, that was our next slide. Anyway, so in the years after Man the Hunter, we had dozens of field studies around the world with forager populations. And this resulted in hundreds of thousands of hours of accumulated observations of foragers. These were international efforts, Americans, British, French, Japanese, and so on, with a big focus on foraging, subsistence, cooperation, sharing, divisions of labor, mobility, social organization. The list could go on. We have a whole section in our paper where we actually outline all this in detail. I don't really have time to go through it today. But again, it produced a very rich body of work, producing a lot of empirical observations. And when you combine it with other sources of evidence, it has been critical for elucidating the pathway of human evolution. We have to be careful, of course, with how we make inferences, but it has been very, very productive. One thing I want to point out here is that this is a new kind of science than what Dart, Ardrey, Morris were talking about. Again, they weren't even looking at ethnographic literature, but even the foundational assumptions were different. They place a lot of emphasis on instinct, right? You don't really see that in human behavioral ecology. We're asking what are the strategies and traits that maximize fitness in particular conditions. And so we're not talking here about behaviors and roles as being fixed, but behavior is flexible, and people have to cooperate to solve problems. And we've been using this framework over the past 40 years to try and understand how we divide labor, and how people in the past would have divided labor. So let me just share with you real quick what those insights look like. So here's a paper from 2007 by Frank Marlowe, looking at what the ethnographic record says about the division of labor. What are men doing? What are women doing? Here we find There's some activities that are all female, gathering vegetable foods, shellfish, eggs, and so on, all the way up to male, where you get kind of large land and aquatic fauna. So again, this is based on large cross-cultural data sets. And so where do we stand on this topic today? Well, it's been a really rich area of research, and I want to just use this abstract from a book chapter by Bird and Cotting in 2015 to show how things have changed, how we've moved beyond kind of the Argery Morris view of men hunt, women gather, and that's it. That's all there is to say, to current controversies and complications. And it's a really interesting area of research. So for one, we're kind of moving beyond these simple dichotomies. I think it's been a long time since people have talked about um, men only hunt, women only gather. Next, they talk about how divisions of labor are multifaceted, not only based um, on gender, but also age, and it's not limited to monogamous marital pairs. This speaks to the fact that divisions of labor are complicated and they're multi-level. Hunter-gatherers live in multi-level societies. Cooperation occurs in a multi-level context. Another big development has been that we've moved beyond just talking about hunting versus gathering. So divisions of gender take the form not generally not of meat and vegetables, but the acquisition of high and low variance food. So it's really more about risk taking than it is about the food itself. And then there's also been really interesting debates over the past 20, 30 years on why there is a division of labor at all. Is it because men and women are dividing to have complementary specializations, or are they pursuing different currencies, different goals? And that's beyond the scope of this talk, but just to say that I think the consensus view is that divisions of labor do exist, they are flexible, and we're still trying to figure out exactly why they exist.
Hmm.
Now, part of this is about the fact that humans have this really long life history. It takes us a long time to acquire skills. I'm sure all of us who have done fieldwork with foragers and tried to do what they do, you fail miserably. I know I do, get treated like a child, basically. Um, but I understand why, right? These are skills that are just as hard as becoming a lawyer or a doctor. And so it takes a long time to develop the skills, but once you get good at them, you produce a lot of food. And that's what we see in this plot from a paper we wrote a few years ago, where return rates get really, really high in the 30s and 40s. And at this point, you're producing way more than you need for yourself. And of course, this is what we then share out. So it takes a long time to develop, but then you share it out. And then as you get older, of course, you um, become less capable of doing that. But because of this long developmental period, uh, there has to be some degree of specialization. Again, this does not conflict with the idea of flexibility, but there's some degree of specialization. That is kind of an economic explanation for a division of labor that isn't reliant on, um, just positing kind of strong sex differences. So according to this way of thinking, human behavioral ecologists, hunter-gatherer scholars, we know that women's hunting is it's not a surprise. It's something that we've been talking about for decades, and it's something we should expect to see. The key question is, when does it happen, and why does it happen? There's also, the role of culture here, which is absolutely critical, and I think kind of being left out of these conversations these days. I could pull any number of quotes, but I really like this one by Megan Beasley talking about complementarity among men and women um, of the Kung, and sort of this link between protection from heat and like dancing, and it's just this really beautiful description about the cultural background to divisions of labor. And this gets to the point that I said before, is that we need to really think about how foragers themselves are conceiving of these differences. I think that contains a lot of critical information that again is kind of getting lost in these current debates. Now, with this framework, we're actually able to construct, I think, a reasonable view about how divisions of labor might have looked in the past. Um, but we're actually using this logic of behavioral ecology. So this is our women's hunting paper that I showed the screenshot from earlier, where we kind of summarize the conditions under which women hunt, and then we ask, would those conditions have been present in the Middle Paleolithic? And if they were, then that means that probably female hunting did occur under the right circumstances. So I don't think we need to be dogmatic about this at all. But again, I'll just emphasize that it's the logic that I've been laying out that allows us to make this conclusion, right? We're not treating foragers as living fossils, as has been stated in these debates, but we're treating them as people, just like you and me, who are looking to solve problems. And I also see people in the past as looking to solve problems within a 24-hour day in which they're very busy and they might have solved problems in the same ways. And I just showed this picture because, this will resonate with maybe with Helga. This is a picture of head smash and buffalo jump, not far from where I live in Alberta in Canada. And it, just looks like a little cliffside right here. But this is actually a spot where for over 10,000 years, indigenous hunters have uh, gotten buffalo to stampede over these cliffs. And what you see right here, this is actually, you know, 15 or so meters of bone bed of accumulated bison kills from thousands and thousands of years. And what they would do is they would draw the buffalo in the fall when they were nice and fat on these plateaus in these game drives over the cliff. They'd fall down, get injured, and then they would finish them off. This is the kind of hunting in which women likely would have been involved, certainly along the game drives here, and you can actually still see stones that marked the edges of those game drives. But if this kind of ecological conditions were more common in the past, I think women's hunting could have been common in the past. Okay, moving on to sort of the last part here. How are these three meanings of man the hunter connected? So I've argued so far that they tend to be conflated. They're confused. Um, but in reality, what I found was that they're only kind of marginally connected. These traditions of research, and I put research there because of Robert Ardrey and Morris, developed pretty independently of one another. And if anything, we can say that there was a lot of antagonism between them. So let me just summarize that evidence really quickly. So when Dart, Ardrey, Morris were writing their stuff, I would say it's fair to say that they were largely rejected. When Dart wrote his Predators or Prey paper in 1953, sorry, I forget the title, but it's a prominent paper in 1953. One of the most pointed responses was by Sherry Washburn, who we saw earlier, one of the organizers of Man the Hunter. He said, looking at this evidence, it looks like Australopiths were probably the hunted rather than the hunters. He was also highly critical of Ardrey as Ardrey's books were coming out. He called him a popularizer of data he does not understand. Okay, pretty harsh. Anthropologist Edmund Leach, social anthropologist, said Ardrey's books are best left alone altogether. And then in a book review, Marshall Solon says Ardrey presents us with a view of human nature that does not make relevant the accumulated anthropological evidence of man's behavior. What does he mean by this? What he means is he's ignoring ethnography. Okay. More on that in one moment. Now, if you do a search in Man the Hunter volume of Ardrey or Dart, you find that Ardrey is mentioned once and very critically, and Dart, as far as I can tell, is not mentioned at all. And then subsequently, when you look at the development of human behavioral ecology, it did not involve Dart, Ardrey, Morris at all. It was simply not mentioned. They were simply not mentioned. Now, similarly, Ardrey, he was very hostile toward ethnography, and I was trying to figure out why this is, and there's a lot of clues to it in his writing. I think one is that Ardrey was concerned with what he referred to as a pre-cultural phase of human evolution. He saw modern day hunter-gatherers as too advanced, so to speak, and also too marginalized to suit his arguments. He was interested in the deep, deep past, right? And he saw modern hunter-gatherers as not relevant at all for reconstructing human evolution. Now, of course, to even say pre-cultural now, it doesn't really make any sense because we acknowledge that other animals have culture, right? But nevertheless, this is why he dismissed any evidence at all for modern foragers. There was a point in one of his books where he reviewed Lee's evidence of women's foraging at Man the Hunter. So I thought, okay, this should be really interesting. He goes through it and then he just rejects it. He doesn't give any reasons. He says our remaining primitive hunting peoples depend more on the hunt than is generally accepted. So he was basically just rejecting what Lee was saying. And he also says that to look at contemporary hunter-gatherers as a guide to the past is the living fossil fallacy. So it's accepted by observers who take as their model contemporary hunting peoples to inform us as her way in ancient times. So you can see his line of thinking here. And then in sort of coup de grace, he says modern foragers are human evolution's losers. And this kind of harkens a little bit to the debates about hunter-gatherer marginality, about hunter-gatherers being pushed to lands that kind of no one else wants, and therefore providing a skewed impression of how hunter-gatherers would have lived in the past. That is a robust and very interesting debate, but Ardrey doesn't really engage with it. He just kind of dismisses them. Now, I want to talk for a second about Washburn because he came out in our analysis as a really interesting figure here. As I said, he had a pretty outsized influence, not only with the title of Man the Hunter, but with really the course of the field in the 1960s. And what we argue is that his version of the hunting hypothesis, although it was more defensible than Ardrey's, which was kind of blood-soaked, he had a kind of narrow focus on male cooperation and that he was overlooking the significant contributions of women in foraging societies, as well as cooperation. This is another story from Richard that was very interesting, which was that in the editing phase of the book, he asked Washburn to put in more about cooperation into the chapter on hunting. And Washburn did, apparently. I don't know what exactly he put in or what it looked like before, but apparently he obliged. And then 15 years later, I think it was something like early 1980s, Washburn went up to him and he said, I should never have added that. I shouldn't have listened to you. It's not about that. That was wrong and it's still wrong. And so you should go visit the paper I wrote with Richard to see those details. But I thought that was kind of interesting when we think about Washburn and his kind of evolving views. But one thing that I think is striking is that because Washburn, with his new physical anthropology, he was laying the foundation for what our field looks like today. Like, in a real sense, we are swimming in Washburn's water of comparative research, of not just this like storytelling, of a focus on hypothesis testing. And he trained so many students, including women who would go on to advance feminist critiques of the ideas that Washburn presents in Man the Hunter. So in the years following Man the Hunter, there was, this book, Woman the Gatherer, and this book wasn't denying that men tend to hunt, women tend to gather. It was more centering gathering itself as a driver of human adaptation. And Adrian Zillman, one of the leaders of this way of thinking, was a Washburn student. And apparently Washburn wasn't too happy with his, students contradicting him. I guess who would be? But it is very interesting that he kind of set the stage for that. Now, in the 1980s, it seems like Washburn's views may have been softening a little bit. So here's a book review he wrote of the Woman the Gatherer volume, and it's with Sharon Raniere, and they say something really interesting. They say obviously the traditional view is in part correct, but it underestimated the economic and social contributions made by women, or even more infuriating, it simply omitted them. So I don't know. This may be a little bit of making up the past on the part of Washburn here, because you could argue that he was sort of the one omitting them, but here he is saying that that shouldn't have been done. But then later in the piece, he ends up being like quite critical of that volume. So it's kind of interesting to think about Washburn in his later years, looking at his legacy, and it must have been quite sort of complicated. And so, in the context of Man the Hunter, Washburn comes off as kind of like a stodgy old guy, of sort of representing a traditionalist view. But it's important to remember with Washburn is that he was kind of on the cutting edge with other social issues at the time, even if he was behind the times on gender. So he gave a very well-known talk on the study of race at the 1963 AAAS conference in response to Carlton Coon, who was, publishing The Origin of Races and promoting racist ideas. And he was saying, like, look, there's just no evidence to support this. And back at that time, a lot of people disagreed with Washburn and thought that he shouldn't have been talking about this the way that he was, but we now see it as being, progressive. Also important to note that Washburn was highly skeptical of sociobiology in the mid 70s. So this is another piece in the New York Review Books by Washburn going after sociobiology. And he was basically saying, look, sociobiology is not paying attention to human culture, to society. When E.O. Wilson says that genes are kept in a leash, that's really flattening the human experience. And so, you know, I think people might sometimes lump Washburn with sociobiologists, but actually the truth is something very different. So I just want to point out that this complicated legacy of Washburn. Now, with this kind of, I hope, more nuanced perspective of what Man the Hunter was and is today, we can actually look back and ask, what were people missing, even given evidence at the time of Man the Hunter? And I feel like female cooperation is one of these things that the empirical evidence for it was actually there in the 60s, but it was still sort of being ignored. And I think that's really interesting that that's the case. Only recently have human behavioral ecologists really emphasized this, I would say. So here's a special Phil Trans issue from 2023 on cooperation among women. Of course, I'll give a shout out to Rag here. You guys have been talking about female coalitions and cooperation for a long time. So I think that's great. But I think overall as a field, maybe we've been a little bit late to the show here. And again, but we need sort of a more objective view of this history to come to that conclusion. So in kind of summarizing here, what I try to do is distinguish between popular and scientific unsound framings of Man the Hunter, comparing them with these more nuanced anthropological perspectives and emphasizing that when we critique these ideas, which we should be doing, of course, let's avoid conflating these different models and using straw men to get high profile, popular articles. So we think that researchers should consider specifying which models or maybe specific chapters from Man the Hunter they're critiquing. Like I said, if you are talking about Solons and Washburn, they're saying very different things at the Man the Hunter conference. And we need to distinguish those and treat them as different. We need to consider emic perspectives from forager populations, and of course, recognize the importance of cooperation. I don't see it as men versus women in these cases. If anything, it's about how you can work together to achieve, great human things. And in closing here, I'll just leave this quote from Levi Strauss. This is actually the last thing that he says in his concluding remarks, and I think it's pretty apropos for the talk today. So, like I said, this is a work in progress. I would love to hear feedback. I'm sure we got some things wrong, so very happy to hear your thoughts. Thank you. Let's see. I'll stop sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All
Thank you
right.
so much for that.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to hear any thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. It's a
So,
very, very comprehensive
Yeah,
discussion.
covering a lot of ground. And
Yeah.
Helga,
Yeah.
I meant to give you a shout out there. I think you've had some of the I find it really cool evidence about again that's like emic view of foragers, and you
Mhm.
said that in your conversations that women say they find hunting boring and they don't want to do it, and I think that I
It's
think that says
because,
a lot.
yeah, no, it's because when men go hunting, generally they stay very quiet so
Mhm.
that their
Yeah.
voices don't disturb, the game that they're approaching. They tend to um, in fact, the success ratio is sort of 1 in 7, I think, hunts is successful. And since it's not as reliable as going gathering, and it's not
Right.
as fun because
Yeah.
men. I don't know how many people have actually gone gathering regularly, or at least followed along with their camera, with hunter-gatherers in the field. But I can tell you one thing: they chatter about all kinds of gossip, like they're talking about, oh, look at there and look at there. They're observing the environment. If they see game, like a herd of wildebeest going by or something, they talk about that, and everybody is reminded to let the guys know. Um,
Hmm.
it- they also sing. They sing songs at each other. They make jokes, mostly jokes about the men, um, which is probably why they don't really like to have the men come along gathering. I don't know. But sometimes, when I wasn't allowed to go, I had a feeling they were talking about me. But gathering is a very kind of, in my experience anyways, it's a kind of lighthearted group activity that's fun. And hunting is very different, and that's why they said that. It's kind of boring to. And you see, the thing is that what that indicated to me is that women knew what hunting was like because they'd sometimes done it. It's not as if it was an absolute impossibility for men to go gathering and women to go hunting. In fact, there was a man I knew who lost his wife while I was in the field, and he joined the women regularly gathering food because he had 2 young children. So um, I think the other thing I was saying before we got started here, um, because I brought up this whole issue of, why is it called Man the Hunter with Richard Lee? And he said he would rather have called it Woman the Gatherer or People the Foragers. But
Hmm.
that what he told me was that um, Werner Gren had insisted on that, and I have a feeling that the fact that Washburn was supporting that term is also important. It's not one that I remember from that conversation, but I know that I think he suffered over the years because people have kind of disliked the term as time goes on. And feminist scholars in particular have felt that it was unnecessarily discriminatory,
Yep.
as our
Exactly.
past was dominated by male hunting. Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
Um, I'm currently working on a book with Bob Hitchcock, who is
Oh.
one of the students of Henry Harpending and
Hmm.
Patrick Burr that I met when I was starting my field work.
Hmm.
Um, and what what we're doing is we're putting forward the a model based on not economic activities, but ecological impact. In other words, that humanity evolved as a keystone species of ecological engineers using fire and also, from the women's point of view, replanting
Hmm.
of important food species. And of course, you may not know this, but probably do, that most hunter-gatherer camps are abandoned and almost never used again.
Mm.
Well, I was with the women. We would detour from old camp to old camp. And some of these this is the camp where that was named after my grandmother or something. And these areas were just hot spots of ecological diversity of all of the
Totally.
important food plants, you
Totally.
know. And that's something that I think has also been discovered in the Serengeti, I think, that pastoral camps, old pastoral camps, became hotspots of ecological diversity. And that, just the whole process of becoming a hunter-gatherer kind of creature was was simultaneously affecting the trophic flows of the entire ecosystem.
Mhm.
Um, One of the people who came up with the term keystone species suggested before he died that, in fact, he wrote a paper on it with one of his colleagues, suggesting that humans represent the primary hyper keystone species within each ecosystem. And I would really like that to be explored. That's basically what we're writing the book about. Anyway, enough
Oh,
said.
that sounds great. I look forward to that. And yeah, we see the same thing with like abandoned bobcat camps. It's amazing to see the
Mm.
richness. So yeah, that's great. Thank you. I see a
Ivan,
few hands up.
Ivan, you want
Ivan? Okay.
to?
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really great, Vivek. Great talk. You put everything together to really give a great overview. And I read the paper this afternoon. Um, I don't know if it's going to be useful, but I
Sure.
highlighted a couple bits in the paper that I think I had a couple of points to raise. Where was it? There was a bit when you mentioned about Australia in the paper.
Okay.
And you mentioned, no evidence of agriculture. That I don't think I'm not sure that's accurate because, well, do you know the book Dark Emu? You ever read
I
that book?
do, but sorry, would you mind just for everyone? Can you just like maybe read the sentence? So
I was just trying to find it.
okay.
I wanted to do that. Wait there, I will get it. Where's it highlighted? That must be before that. Right there. Oh my God. Here we go. Page 24 of the PDF. Thus, with the important exception of the indigenous peoples of Australia, who did not practice agriculture prior to European contact, all
Okay.
ethnographic known foragers have a long history of a direct or indirect interaction with farmers. I think actually in Australia, well, Pascoe and others have argued that actually they did have agriculture and they had quite sophisticated technologies, storage economies, and so forth, weirs. And actually, he really beautifully describes, European colonizers moving through this landscape where you see clear evidence of agriculture. It's really worth reading that book, actually.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
I
a
know it's Dark
criticism,
Emu, but I
Vivek.
haven't
It's a
read it.
super
But
paper. I just thought I'd point it out in
no,
case
yeah, that's
you
great,
saw.
man. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
And
Okay. Yeah.
another thing, like it was really nice you mentioned at the end of the talk, about Chris Camilla and Ian's work alongside that of other papers talking about
Yeah.
female cooperation. And I thought maybe, this should be mentioned in the actual. I don't know if I did it only. I only spent like an hour or so reading through. I did go through it fairly quickly, but I thought that might be great to mention that in the paper itself because obviously
Right.
their research goes back decades, and they've been pushing this idea of female cooperation for a very long time. So I thought that would be worth exploring.
Yeah.
And there was one other point. I'm only saying it in case it's useful. Everything was awesome that you said. Yeah, it was a
All good, all
fantastic
good.
paper. Yeah. Where was it that I noted? Yeah, it's this page. So it's again page 26. You're saying you've got one sentence where the hunter-gatherers were largely egalitarian. Yeah. Then you've got all the references. Then you say whether encephalization was driven primarily by social or ecological selection pressures. Um, I just thought in that kind of paragraph there, um, you could link that in nicely with like Sarah Hurdy's ideas about female cooperation and also Chris and Camilla and Ian's work there would be a really nice touch, I think, because it really would fit in that paragraph perfectly. And
Right
it's
on.
kind of a really powerful framework to understand that fits in with your general argument really well. But
Right
anyway,
on, right
that's
on.
all. And I really loved it. It was really awesome.
Not very
And
useful.
loads of great stuff there, lots of nuance in it too. Brilliant.
Cool. Thanks, Ivan.
Thanks, man.
Jerome,
Okay, how about Jerome?
great to
Hi,
see you.
hi Vivek.
Hi there. Thanks.
Really great. Thank you for such a systematic
Yeah.
look at that rather uncomfortable phrase, man the hunter.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I just felt that was sort of missing were the more sort of emic perspectives on what hunting is.
Mm.
Because the whole idea of man the hunter is very much based on this well, utilitarian way of categorizing that tends to plague anthropologists and others, where we look at the sort of, what's the output? What's the thing that happens? Well, an animal is killed. But
Hmm.
actually, that process is one which implicates the whole community.
Hmm.
Um, and so, for instance, in my work in the Congo Basin, it's very clear that your behavior, your relationship with your marital relations, all have a huge impact on hunting. So I did a paper on something called ekila, which is it's a sort of a complex category that the Bambangele people I lived with used to try and talk about these relationships and how the context of one's behavior, in particular sexual relationships,
Hmm.
play out in hunting. So if your wife sleeps around, you'll keep missing and you'll wonder why you miss. But actually, it's because your wife's sleeping around. But
Hmm.
but at the same time, also the meat that's brought back to the camp has to be socialized in a sense from that wild, dangerous animal to something that's safe for people to consume.
Hmm.
And that is a critical role that women play in the hunting process, making sure that the meat is fairly divided, that everybody gets a share which is relevant to their needs. So old people, for instance, don't get given bony bits. They get given the nice, soft, fatty bits because they haven't got enough teeth to chew the bony bits properly. And those are the sorts of things that women are surveying as the hunt comes in. But also
Right.
before the hunt, uh, women will play a big role in preparing for the hunt. So I was surprised when some men said, "Oh, we're going on a women's hunt," and I thought, "Oh, what's a women's hunt?" And they were going elephant hunting. And the reason they call it a women's hunt is because the women are ritually responsible for the way they express it is tying down the elephant so that the men can then catch it, get to it, and kill it. So the actual hunt has already been organized by the women in a ritual sense. They drink a special brew and travel in trance over the forest and say they tie up the animal, and then they can tell the men where to go to find it. And they even designate which man should be the hunter. They have
Hmm.
a very sort of
Oh,
forceful way of. It's not something that you undertake lightly. Of course, elephants are rather terrifying when you meet them in the forest.
right.
Um, so I just wanted to really emphasize that we have this way of isolating hunting from much broader social processes, which are really important for the people involved, and that even though women do hunt in the Bambangeli society, but they hunt in very particular ways, which are
Yep.
connected with some of their values about blood, actually. So women coming across an antelope or a small animal will bludgeon it. They'll take their machete if they have one in the hand and turn it upside down so it's the blunt end and hit it on the back of the neck. Or they may actually try and pick it up and hit it against a tree to kill it. But what they won't do and what they find really repulsive is piercing. So they would
Oh.
never stab the animal. They would never cut its throat. And there were a couple of Muslim traders that floated by on a boat one day, and an antelope was swimming across the river. They caught it and they cut its neck to make it halal, to drain the blood.
Oh.
And this was so repulsive to the women. They talked about it for days and days afterwards, how disgusting it was that all this blood had been shed
Ooh.
unnecessarily. Um, and that brings me to the work of an anthropologist you didn't mention, who I think is very interesting on this subject, Alain Testard,
Mm.
Oh
who
yeah, yeah, yeah.
sadly published mostly in French, or sadly for people who don't speak French.
Yeah, I've experienced that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he does this extraordinary analysis of tool use among hunter-gatherer groups around the world, and he finds very clearly a pattern whereby men focus on tool use that pierces, whereas women focus on tool use that pounds, that slices, or that bludgeons or bashes things. And that this, I think, it gets back more to these emic perspectives where it's really about the way that you do things as opposed to what you do. So women will hunt, women will participate in the hunts in many different ways, from preparing the hunts through to the cooking of the meat and the preparation of that it's done properly and respectfully, so the hunters continue to find meat when they hunt. Anyway, just to suggest that perhaps the critique could go a bit wider in how you're framing this, to consider some of these more emic perspectives that don't just focus on the act of catching an animal, but focus on the way it's done and the implication of many different parts of society in that process, and particularly women and women's work is very central to the hunt.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those are fantastic observations. Yeah, I did have just one slide on that, and I knew I was giving it short shrift, so sorry about that.
No, sorry
If you check out our paper led by Jordy Hoffman here in hunter-gatherer research, we actually that paper has kind of a compilation of all those sorts of things that you're talking about. But I think it's critical, and I think it's also something being lost again in these current debates now of just how these people are seeing their own society and how much richer of a view that is, and the kind of stuff that you're saying, rather than simply, look, women hunt too. I mean, it's just so much more fascinating. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So,
well, I look forward to reading those papers. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Jerome. I'm going to jump in here if it's okay. Yeah, there's a couple of things following up what Ivan was saying. We can see it was a wonderful presentation of the arc of all these different aspects of Man the Hunter. I thought it was fantastic, Vivek, and I've had a go at reading the paper a couple of times.
Yep.
But one of the biggest kind of attacks, dismantling of Man the Hunter as it was, of course, is the whole grandmother hypothesis attack. It was done in, archaeology, paleontology, life history theory, evolutionary ecology with the Hadza. And so it was really not just a woman the gatherer thing, but just calling into question what can we, how reliable actually was Man the Hunter putting it in a long-term evolutionary perspective. But there's also something else that I think, you do reference Hawkes and colleagues, of course you do, but to kind of pull out a bit more, both from the grandmother hypothesis, but also from Hurdy in her journey, bringing that grandmother hypothesis together with like Tomasello and intersubjectivity, going to the cooperative childcare. Now, why this becomes so important, and of course it connects with Frank Marlowe's investigation on residence rules and the impact of residence on male, on how much men actually can produce.
Sure.
So one of the things that is left out in terms of what is in there in Man Hunter is you reference one of James Woodburn's chapters, but you leave out the key chapter in our view, which is the one where he highlights bride service. And he really demonstrates it's not, this isn't, in our evolution, it's not just about pair bonds. It's about the female linkages through kinship. So mother and daughter acting together, and the son-in-law is marrying in, and the mother-in-law to him is boss in many ways, or is the one who has demand, is obligations that are owed to her. And that was classic with the Hadza, but of course it's not just the Hadza. Bride service tends to be a pretty universal institution for most nomadic foragers, as far as I understand it. And we tend to think of pair bonds with that sort of rejig dynamic. That's a rejigging of Man the Hunter. What else? Oh, was going to add something there on the issue of bride service, and now I'm losing it. Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh, Chris, you carry on, and I'll see.
That's great.
Can I just say that bride service? Well, there's several things that do get left out, and again, I will really say, Vivek, that was such a magnificent overview. It was so exciting, so funny, and so clarifying, putting it all together in that brilliant way. So yes, I mean, but in a way, following from Camilla, but also from Jerome, things which sort of just tend to get left out. I mean, I can think of three huge things which just about always get left out, owing to our own cultural kind of feelings of, awkwardness, or even, I don't know, even our own taboos. I mean, one of them's the actual scheduling of large-scale hunting expeditions. So I mean, it's just so clear that hunter-gatherers never pray to the sun. If they are going to invoke some some assistance from some celestial being, it's going to be the moon, and that tends to get left out because people get very worried over here about moonshine and anything to do with that. And linked to that, of course, again, and very closely connected to what Jerome was saying, is the issue of blood. And then of course, and then bride service. So the blood gets left out because of menstrual blood, and no one really wants to talk.
Penny, the country vote.
What's going on? What's that? Something happened there.
Somebody please mute. Who is?
Yeah. Somebody. So
I can
gets left out. Menstruation gets left out.
Okay.
And the reason why bride service gets left out, I've often wondered why is it sort of unmentionable? And as far as I can work out, it's because Westerners treat bride service as, oh my God, oh horror of horrors. It's a form of prostitution. It's sex for meat.
Sure.
And so you can't impute prostitution to hunter-gatherers without being, without. And of course, bride service has got absolutely nothing whatever to do with prostitution. It's, I mean, it's all sorts of. We could go into it forever. But anyway, the thing about bride service is that it's inseparable from women's collective ability to say no to sex. That's the critical thing. The mother-in-law that Camilla was talking about, she has to be able to say to a young man who's come to stay with his sweetheart for a while, you're here initially on probation, on trial. Prove yourself a generous, good-humored hunter, and you can probably enjoy your relationship. But prove lazy, any kind of unpleasant sexual behavior, and you're out on your neck. And it takes a long time for that young man to prove that he's worth keeping as a son-in-law. So sex strike is what I used to call it, and I don't mind calling it that still. And when Jerome was talking about the elephant hunt, the critical point is that women, it isn't unusual. In fact, I think it's normal for women collectively to be the managers of male hunting. It's as strong as that. That is actually what bride service is about. It's the mother-in-law, many other relatives, maybe quite a few, young men, brothers needed as well to make sure that the males behave. But the behavior required is courage in hunting, and it's just normal in that sense. Not just an elephant hunt, which is what Jerome's describing. Any hunting is going to be kind of managed by women. I think it's really important to understand that.
Right.
And then the other thing, as I was saying, which gets left out is the blood. And it's so critically important to understand that, as Jerome was saying, that women often hunt, they won't shed blood in the hunt. And Jerome's concept, ekila, is again a very widespread concept, as Alan Tester and others have argued. And the core of ekila is you do not mix menstrual blood with the blood of the hunt, which initially sounds extraordinarily puzzling. What on earth? Why would it be so immoral, so deeply immoral, to let those forms of blood get confused? Obviously, as you mentioned, we talked about that, me, Ian, and Camilla, in our Human Symbolic Revolution article in 1995. But I mean, everything since then has confirmed all of our predictions, and it is so important, it seems to me, to be emic, as Jerome was saying, but actually to go quite far in actually being able to come up with genuinely testable predictions about what you should find and what you shouldn't expect to find if that model is correct, going to details of hunter-gatherers cosmology. And the cosmology is so exciting and so interesting. And at the root of hunter-gatherer traditions and cosmology are these ideas about not mixing blood. And of course, as you were saying, hunter-gatherers are people like us trying to solve problems. If hunting blood and menstrual blood were to be confused, end of story. It would be, I mean, the levels of misunderstanding, violence, blah, 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 those two types of blood, they absolutely need not to be confused. Disaster would follow, and we need to understand precisely why. And then once we start investigating that, it gives us new insights into how the gender division of labor emerged, and how actually it would have been very largely women's strategies which made necessary a gendered division of labor, because women needed to be able to say no to men. Any young woman going off and joining the men with the hunt would have been completely undermined women's bride service strategy. You can't possibly control what a young woman does when she's out on a hunting expedition with the other men. It all makes wonderful sense, and I'm just saying, and I know, Vivek, that you are very sympathetic to all this, but I'm just saying that it seems rather important that certain things which just happen to conflict with our own cultural taboos don't get omitted, because that's just I don't know, a dangerous road to go down.
Fantastic.
Great.
I agree. Yeah.
So go on, Vivek. Go on.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was only just going to pop back with, it was a couple of when you go, you and your colleagues go into this presentation of the sort of consensus of what we know from the last common ancestor right through to the Holocene. And you were just sort of summing up. This is on page 18 on the PDF. And talking, and the references you gave as the authoritative references made me wince a bit. And I'm talking about Foley and Gamble and Chappé.
Oh my God.
Right. Foley, the reason I'm wincing is because those guys are signed up to man, meaning male, the hunter, in control of the economy and in control of females. They really are. And Chappé in control of kinship and marriage. I mean, they sign up on that. They absolutely are. And even though Foley and Gamble published the same year as Sarah Hrdy published Mothers and Others, her volume takes it away. I mean, just goes away from where they are.
I can't help just interjecting here. Chappé thinks that language was invented so that dominant males could instruct females as to correct sexual behavior.
Is that right? Okay. Let's familiar with that.
I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't ever put them, but if you put
the
leading edge, that is, whoa. It's very questionable.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for that. Noted. Yeah. We'll balance that out.
Yeah, do that.
That's great.
Any more thoughts? And
maybe Elena?
I think, is that Eleanor? Do you need to go first, or is Ian going to talk?
Yeah. Hi, Vivek. Lovely talk. Lovely
thanks.
Only a minor thing, which again is just sort of filling it out even more, fleshing it out a bit more. And it's possible that I missed it because it was rushed read, so I sort of focused on the beginning and the end and haven't read the middle properly. But in evolutionary terms, I think you touched on it in your presentation just now in terms of the role of collective big game hunting.
Yeah.
In evolutionary terms, that becomes really prominent. Now, how that plays out in sort of sexual division of labor, I think Chris has already touched on, but like this is crucial for really, and it's something that Kristen Hawkes never really developed, but like this is clearly not about. I mean, if it's collective big game hunting predominantly by males, then females are using a slightly different calculus for looking at male qualities than we're familiar with, where most hunting is sort of more individual.
Yes. Interesting.
And I think this needs to be sort of somehow sort of drawn into the debate.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. I mean, can you say a little more? Like
Well,
what
I
qualities?
mean, it
Like,
also ties in with
yeah,
sort of Chris's point about the moon and the phase locking of hunting. That sort of like, and this goes back to Kristen's work. What's so apparent in the Hadza material, but also in Southern Africa, is that this what would normally be the season of stress is the late dry season, where there's no more honey, no more fruit, unless you happen to have mongongo nuts or something like, it is a seasonal stress. And Frank Marlowe expected that this should be when women should show the lowest body fat ratios, and they found just the opposite. And they could only explain this in terms of lunar phase locked nightstand hunting in the late dry season. And this was by far their most productive form of hunting. And both Burton Jones and Kristen Hawkes had been drawing this out 30 years ago. But they were sort of more interested in early Homo, and they never really related it to recent human evolution, modern human origins. But that's the question that needs to be asked. When was it? Because lions are such successful nighttime predators, you
yeah,
do not want to be by the waterhole except during moonlit nights. So that's why it's got to be in the nights leading up to full moon, which is when it is. But if you do that, then and therefore you need, and of course, this is a spear technology. So like you're talking about effective distances of like 10, 15 meters. You've got to get that close. You can in evolutionary terms, you have to be very close to the game trails as they
right,
approach the waterholes.
right.
And just to say that Ian's arguing that around 160,000 years ago, this wasn't just one sort of particular sort of hunting technique. It's like saying if there was ever kind of bottleneck at a certain point, it was thanks to getting through that bottleneck, that difficult period, that's particularly every dry season. It was thanks to this particular form of hunting, which was connected so closely with the moon, that actually, we became a successful Homo sapiens. So I mean,
Right,
it's
right, right.
actually, and it's just a fact that hunter-gatherer mythology and cosmology is just hugely connected with the moon. You mustn't go hunting when your wife is menstruating. You don't go hunting with dark moon. Oh, but, because for very real reasons, because that's the time when the lions would be on the prowl. So I'm just saying, for weird reasons, all that it doesn't translate. Or better to put it, it gets lost in translation somehow. I don't know. It's fascinating, wonderfully rich, incredibly interesting, but somehow those real recurrent details of hunter-gatherer cosmology and practice in hunting, I don't know. They just somehow it all gets subtly, in very subtle ways, censored out of even
Sure,
scientific literature. It's
sure,
a
sure. Yeah.
shame.
Vivek, I told you about this unpublished paper of James Woodburn, which
Yeah,
he
yeah, yeah,
editing to make it legible,
yeah.
and it gives incredible fieldwork observation on the Hadza belief system in relation to the lunar cycle and menstrual cycle. So
Oh,
it's
amazing.
an extraordinary piece that needs to be got out there. In
Yeah. Well, I'm very curious to see how
all
that's
there.
going.
Yeah,
That's
I know
awesome.
you love it for hunter-gatherer research. I
Yeah,
don't know,
yeah, we
I
would.
couldn't go into hunter-gatherer research actually, but yes,
Sure. All good. Yeah.
yes, no,
Yeah. Well, thank you for all this. Very
yeah, yeah.
excellent comments. Yeah.
Anybody else would like to ask questions or add in to this? Helga, do you want to do something?
Helga, you
Helga,
can't hear you.
can't hear.
Unmute. Oh,
I should, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This isn't I'm not making a comment about the timing of hunts or the moon or anything like that or blood mixing. But it has to do with the behavior of game animals. And one thing I noticed when gathering with the women was we'd be walking along. Actually, it's not even just game animals. We walked past a pride of lions that was asleep, and they kind of looked up and then, went back to sleep, and we just kept walking. And we passed, within, I would say at least 200 meters, or I should say at most. But these animals saw us and took no alarm.
Oh,
Okay. In other words, and I started asking about it. In other words, what they did not show when they saw a human being, or at least, human beings such as the quad that I was with, um, as dangerous. They didn't have what we call predator fear. Okay. Now, there's a very important aspect there. If an animal does not have extreme predator fear, you can actually get quite close to it. Your hunting blind is much more effective, even if they smell
mhm.
you, because they're not going to associate that smell with danger. I think from what I saw in the Kalahari, these very small arrows, with the little tips on them and the poison and so on,
Mhm.
those are hunting tools that can only be used. And this, of course, is why I thought of this because you referred to the distances, right? Um, between the hunter and the animals, that they can only be used over very short distances. That's
Right.
not a very powerful type of hunting technology. It actually only becomes possible when the humans involved have, in a sense, made the animals lose their predator fear. Okay, and predator fear is also what leads lions to attack you, and various game animals to become dangerous to approach. Like
Right.
the bison who knock people over in Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah.
And they can be approached very close, much closer than a truly wild animal would approach you. But the essence of what modern hunter-gatherers did during the Middle Stone Age, when they developed these much more refined small hunting weapons and distance hunting, we call it distance hunting, but it's actually close distance hunting, or further. No, it means you can be at a distance when you hunt, but only if the animal allows you to come close enough to actually hit it, right? Which is very different from a bunch of you going out there with spears surrounding an animal and trying to spear it or bludgeon it to death. That's very dangerous. I mean, all those broken bones on Neanderthals tell that story.
Mm.
Right.
So when you're talking about how humans, modern humans, I mean, I think Neanderthals, um, depending on your perspective, were probably Homo sapiens. They were just, in a sense, what do they call it? Archaic Homo sapiens. And
Mm.
so, what made the change? If any of you have ever heard of this, was likely the consequences of the Central African megadroughts, where people were, um, along with all of their ecosystem, were pushed to the edges. The Kalahari, Southern Africa would be at one end, and along the coastal areas where there were rivers coming down and so on, those would have been the much reduced habitats
Yes.
that would have supported hunter-gatherers. And in order to prevent the animals in those areas from going extinct, particularly the important game species, from going extinct due to predator fear, which would lead them to fail to reproduce. Because with high, high levels of predator fear, animals often don't even come into season, or if they do, they have very high
Mm.
rates of miscarriage, or they
Mm.
they just abandon their babies. This has been documented. So people began to notice this because they were living quite close to the animals and were observing these local essential population starting to dwindle if they were
Right.
hunted by humans as well as the other predators in the area. And they began to try and understand how to reduce the fear of humans. And one of the ways to do
Mm.
it is to hunt from a concealed location, to hunt with a very small, hunting instrument, technology like an arrow or a spear thrower,
Mm.
and to use poison. And of course, snaring and trapping in that way also falls within the same um, general grouping. So they altered their technologies and their methods of hunting in
Hmm.
such that the game populations were preserved, they were continuing to reproduce, and they didn't endanger humans because their predator fear led to aggression. If somebody, like I remember one day, um, turning a corner like a bush in a trail. I was actually going to pee, actually, but anyway, so I was trying to go into the bush deeper so I wouldn't bother anybody, and and
Yeah.
and so, and I turned a corner, and all of a sudden I encountered a young leopard. It was just standing there, and I was just standing there, and we looked at each other. And all I did was very gently back away, and the leopard kind of looked at me, cocked its head, and just disappeared into the bush. It wasn't afraid of me.
Mm.
Like
Mm.
the sight of me, because I told people about it later, if at the sight of me that animal had had a surge of terror, right? It very
Right.
well might have turned into aggression. It's an adrenaline response, right? So people understood this
Fascinating.
a
Yeah.
100,000 or more years ago during these African mega droughts. And when they were, in a sense, in much closer contact with the few remaining herds of game animals. And I think that's why they changed their hunting technology. And that change in hunting technology resulted in fewer injuries. And of course, it changed the selection pressures on the human body, right? It would have to, because a smaller hunter, a lighter boned, lighter boned specimen, didn't have to eat as much. I saw an estimate recently that indicated that a Neanderthal male would have to eat between 3,000 and 7,000 calories a day.
God.
Yeah.
Pretty wild.
And
Yeah.
human males, even if they're hunting, don't have to eat that much to
Huh.
compensate for their efforts, right? And so what it means is the smaller people could bring back just as much meat as the bigger people. And in fact, because they could share more of the food they brought back, it meant that their children got more of it. The women in the camp got more of it. And that population probably survived better than a population where the hunters needed to make up for the caloric cost of hunting in such a big way. And so slowly, the physical, sorry, I'm
Yeah, yes.
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
I'll mute myself.
No, it's somebody else.
That was someone else. I just
I'm
muted
just
them. It's
thinking that
okay.
would enable people to do a lot more lazing around, which is one of the things that Vivek's been pointing out. You do a lot of work, get a lot of stuff, and then you can be lazy.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the pattern. Yeah. Well, thanks for those observations. I mean, this is one of the great things about coming here for me is to hear all the cool experiences you've all had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
Great.
I'd just like to add one last thing,
Yeah.
and it's a little bit mischievous in response to Helga. Hunting actually is really, really fun. Um, I
Oh,
I was a vegetarian for many years before going to live in the Congo Basin, realized I needed to eat meat, and that most of the men who I was starting to build relationships with would spend their days wandering around hunting. And so I suddenly realized actually I need to learn this. And it was it well, there are many remarkable things about learning hunting, but the drama is extreme. You're in a life and death battle with an animal that really doesn't want to die, just as you don't want to get hurt. And it really is quite something. And especially in the Congo Basin, where you've got these very large animals, it really can be extremely dramatic. Um, and then the other thing that's really beautiful about hunting is how intimate you become in your relations with the animals that you regularly hunt, because you don't just know them as something to eat and their anatomy from cutting them up and so on, or trying to kill them to understand where you kill them cleanly. But it's also learning about their behavior, their ecology, the things they like to do. You have to anticipate animals generally to hunt them successfully with the sorts of weapons that hunter-gatherers use. You can't stand miles away and just shoot them from a little, sort of a stakeout spot, as so many Western hunters do. You really have to get up close and intimate. And to do that, you really need to understand them, and you need to think about how they're thinking and get into all that. Anyway, it's a very rewarding and beautiful thing to do. And the animals that I got most affectionate towards were the ones that I ended up hunting mostly, because I just started to appreciate the beauty of their lives. But at the same time, I knew the kids and women back in camp were hungry, and we needed something to eat. But it was always something done with respect, with care and admiration for those creatures. Anyway,
And I
sorry, a little.
Very cool.
I mean, I actually had men who had personal names for some of the older antelope and
Oh,
um,
cool.
animals within the range. They'd known them since they were very young. And, you know, by the way, just in response to what you sort of were saying, it's not that I think hunting is boring. It's that that was what the women told me, and it might have been partly said as a joke. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, that's delightful. The love of all the creatures was something I really noticed. I remember when I set up a little camp next to one of the hunter-gatherer camps on the invitation of the people there. And the next day, a couple of the women came to me and indicated, because I hadn't learned much of the language yet, that they wanted to show me something. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. They took me to a tree and pointed at a python. And they told me that this python, I might see this python, but it was their friend
Mm. Wow,
because it kept down the mice
that's
and the
beautiful.
You want to know?
vermin.
I think Ian might have a few things to
You
say
want to
about
know why the Python's their friend, Helga?
Ian.
Yeah.
Tell us
No,
about.
because it was useful in keeping down the small rodents and
The
mice and
vermin.
so on.
Yeah.
I guess it was just, but I think I don't have any explanation. But I was very struck by that, and it was because of that. And they had a name for it, but I've written it down somewhere, but I haven't got access to my notebooks right now. But they had names. People had names for animals that they had watched be born not far away from where they were camping at the time. And particular animals seem to affect people, or at least some people, almost like a friendship. It's hard to explain. It just was so it was so touching in a way. And I remember once following men on a hunt where somebody had come and said they hit this, it was a kudu, I think. And so I was allowed to follow along. And all of a sudden, after about an hour and a half, we came in sight of this animal which was down. And the old guy who was the lead tracker, he suddenly stopped and sighed, and he said, "Oh, it's her."
Mm.
You know, that's so different. It's so different from the way that hunting is viewed as a sport and as a masculine triumph in a lot of modern societies, you
Mm.
know. And then they also circled the animal as it was dying, and they said this prayer, this chanted prayer. Um, Thank you, my sister, for your gift of meat that my children may live. Go to the door of heaven. I'm translating roughly here. And wait for me, because I'll be along very soon and we can be together forever. It's a sacred pact. The animal had, in a sense, gifted them with its meat, and it was seen as a friend. Now, how do you reconcile that with, trophy hunting and so on? You can't. I don't think.
Jerome, I would be interested to hear you respond to that, because you've told me that with the Bayaka, it's not quite like that. There's not a feeling that the animals make a gift of their lives.
Well, I mean, so animals don't give up their lives willingly. They give
No.
with a fight, and many Bayaka, and I think it's particularly because they're hunting, large game, buffalo, uh, sometimes elephants, and you need to be really smart and sneaky, and
Mhm.
really understand those animals to be able to catch them. And
Mhm.
if you're not skillful and you start being sloppy in your execution of the techniques, then you risk very serious damage. And they really, they won't muck around. I've seen what elephants do to people. It's very messy. So I mean, I think if someone had a personal relationship with an animal that they knew, they might feel very emotional about having killed it in a hunt. But generally, the idea is that animals will resist, and you'll have to use all your wile and guile to catch them.
They
Um,
don't have poison where you were.
they do have poisons, yeah, yeah,
It's a nerve poison, so the animal becomes incapable of moving.
running away. But they use that mostly for monkeys.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not effective with elephants, I would think.
no, well, I haven't seen.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
I was going to just add very briefly that, of course, the python. I think Ian's written about all this, but I mean, the python. There's a reason why the python is so frequently a metaphor for a bride service women's coalition. This it's just again and again and again we find a sort of connection between snakes, pythons, rain snakes, and snakes in general with
Hmm.
women's coalitions with their blood. But anyway, yeah, it's a lovely story that you actually felt this relationship with this python.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
That is extraordinary. I think we ought to come to an end to let Vivek off.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vivek, for this amazing talk through this paper and for listening to all these suggestions. And thank you so much, Helga, for coming along with your stories, as well as Jerome. Um, and I hope that Vivek and all your colleagues, we're really looking forward to the paper, and that you'll feel that there's been some worthwhile tips today, or some worthwhile stuff. Also, maybe tell people about your podcast on Friday, because some people may be very interested in that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, so I actually did two podcasts with David Sloan Wilson on hunter-gatherers and the origins of democracy. So those are posted already, but we're having a discussion on Friday that will kind of rehash some of those and then have a Q&A and discussion. Um, I can I can send a link right here real quick.
Do that.
Here we go. Just
Some
one
people might
second.
like to join it. So it should be 5 o'clock London time on Friday. Is that right?
Yeah, noon Eastern time. So are you guys 5 hours ahead of like New York?
5 London.
Okay. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of you would have cool things to
Yeah.
say about this topic. So yeah, feel free to join. But yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to
It
speak
was
to all of you.
absolutely wonderful. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad
And
you liked it, but it's also great to get, constructively critical feedback that helps improve the paper. That's always the best
Really,
kind.
really
Yeah,
wonderful, Vivek.
thank you so much.
Oh, yeah,
Just
yeah,
to
thank you guys.
say to everybody here, this is our last Zoom before summer, but we fully expect RAG to be back at UCL live, but also on Zoom in the autumn, I should think, and usually the autumn equinox. But you can look at the website for up-to-date info, or we're still on Facebook, Mastodon, the Fediverse, and Blue Sky these days, and Vivek's on Blue Sky. So great. Thank you so much, and goodbye to everybody.
Okay. See you, everyone.
Thanks,
Take care. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Ray.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks for having me.